The wind that whispered through the courtyard of Winterfell carried an ancient chill, older and deeper than any season's frost. It slid across the old stone walls, slithered under shut doors, and curled around the silent statues in the crypts below. In those subterranean halls, the presence of the dead stood eternal. Each Stark's likeness was carved in gray granite, their features shaped to reflect the austere lineage of the North. Stone wolves crouched at their feet to stand guard in that endless twilight. The place was as familiar as it was unsettling, for it seemed to pulse with more than just memory. It breathed with a kind of watchful vigilance. Even Jon, who had grown up under Winterfell's roof, sometimes felt like a trespasser within those walls, compelled by an intangible pull that called him below the great keep toward the resting Starks. He could not have explained why. It wasn't a thirst for ghost stories or a young man's fascination with grim lore. It was something deeper, unspoken, as though the entire fortress reached into the marrow of his bones, drawing him from corridor to corridor, until he stood once again at the top of those dark steps leading down. He first sensed the hush that lived in the crypts after the midday meal. The sunlight overhead was watery and thin, typical of the North, and the sky's gray complexion stretched like a silent promise of drizzle. But beneath that sky, Winterfell held a warmth that the rest of the North did not. The walls were heated by the natural hot springs, the stones radiating a pleasant haze. Jon had grown accustomed to that subtle comfort. He had always been especially grateful for it during the times he felt most alone, as if the fortress itself were giving him a gentle reminder that he belonged in some small way. Yet no matter how many times he walked through the courtyard or lingered by the archways, the crypts, those echoing, solemn places, kept stirring in his mind. He would give himself reasons to roam the courtyard, or to help in the stables, or to polish armor alongside the old master-at-arms. But try as he might to occupy his hours, he couldn't escape a quiet compulsion. All his tasks would end eventually, and as the day wore on, he found himself standing by the great keep, looking at the entrance to those lower levels with a sense of longing and dread. He hadn't been there in some weeks, for there was no good reason to go. He had visited the tomb of Lord Rickard Stark but once or twice. He had stood before the statue of Brandon Stark, Ned's elder brother, feeling no real connection. Yet something else in those silent corridors, among the looming shapes of old kings in the North and lords of Winterfell, seemed to beckon him, and it held more power than any rational argument he could muster. Jon had dreamt of the crypts many times, though he never spoke of it. When he woke in the darkness before dawn, he could barely recall the details, only a sense that someone was calling his name softly, not in a voice of sorrow, but in something that bordered on yearning. There was no face to the voice, no hand guiding him, but he felt it all the same, like an unseen presence brushing against his very soul. He wondered if it was his own loneliness shaping such illusions, if his fear of not belonging to the Starks in name somehow conjured them. But what if there was something else? He had no proof, only the persistent feeling that in those dreams, someone waited in the crypts who knew him intimately, who yearned to shield him in a way he had never been shielded. That day, as dusk threatened to creep over the battlements, he abandoned his half-hearted chores and descended. 2 torches sputtered at the top of the stairwell, throwing a wavering glow on the worn steps as he made his way down. Even the steps seemed older than the rest of the castle, carved in centuries past. Darkness wrapped around him, absorbing the echoes of his boots. The flickering yellow light illuminated no more than a few feet ahead, leaving the rest of that cavernous corridor lost in silent black. He walked slowly, as one does in a place that demands reverence. He did not want to break the hush. Even breathing felt like an intrusion. This place was a realm of memory and shadow, a meeting of the living and the long, unbroken line of the dead. When he reached the bottom, he heard only the faint crackle of the torch in his hand. The cold air seemed to cling to his skin, as though the crypt swallowed all vestiges of the warm breath above. He waited, letting his eyes adjust, tilting the torch slowly. The first statue he saw, just off to the left, was that of Lord Rickard Stark, unmovable in granite, hands resting on the stone hilt of a sword. His features wore a timeless solemnity, and at his feet crouched the direwolf that marked him as a Stark. Further down, Jon knew, were the tombs of Lyanna, Brandon, and many others. He'd visited Lyanna's tomb once with Lord Eddard, Ned, whom he called father, though not by blood. Jon remembered the fresh flowers Ned placed there, a small and secret tribute. Even as a boy, Jon had sensed the significance of those flowers, though no explanations were offered. It was the only time he had seen Ned's eyes misted with sorrow. That memory nudged at him whenever he thought of Lyanna Stark. There was another memory that haunted him, from his earliest days, less a memory and more a faint recollection. It was the smell of roses, followed by a woman's shape in half-light, a soothing voice on the edge of hearing. He could never fully recall it, like trying to grasp its smoke between his fingers. Now, as he walked deeper, torchlight flickering on silent faces of stone, that same sense of half-remembered comfort swept over him. He wondered if it was only in his mind. Yet something urged him further, beyond the known tombs, as though a guiding hand pressed gently at his back. He paused, struggling with his own trepidation, but the hush of the crypt seemed to draw him in, each footstep measured, each breath a reminder of how alone he was, and yet how not alone. He reached the place where Lyanna Stark's statue stood. The marble likeness of her was youthful, capturing the fierce beauty she was said to possess in her short life. Jon raised the torch, examining the face carved in stone. There was a softness there, overshadowed by solemn grief, but with a hint of pride or defiance in the tilt of her chin. The dire wolf at her feet appeared more slender than the others, a testament to her unique spirit. Ned would sometimes speak of her, though with few words. Other members of the family hardly spoke of her at all, aside from the old stories that circulated. The Wolf Maid, the Night of the Laughing Tree's rumored identity, the tragedy of Harrenhal. Jon had never known the truth of it all, only fragments. But as he regarded her statue, he felt an ache in his chest as if he had lost something dear, despite never having known it. Her name had always stirred in him something he could not describe, a bond he did not understand. Soft as a whisper, a movement of air brushed past his ear. He spun around, heart jolting in his chest. Torch held high. The corridor was empty. Shadows spread along the walls, wavered, and then settled. The flicker of light played tricks, making it seem as though the carved faces shifted in the gloom. He stared into that silence, ears straining. But there was nothing, only the beating of his own heart, so loud in the hush that he worried it might awaken the dead. Still he sensed it, a presence, fleeting and protective, like a guardian. Absurd, he thought, yet the feeling would not leave him. He turned back to Lyanna's statue, free hand resting on the cold stone pedestal. Her face was blank, unchanging. Yet the lines of the sculpture seemed gentler for an instant, as though the shadows bent in some trick of the light. He took a slow breath and closed his eyes, letting the still air fill his lungs. A memory of warmth touched him. A memory that was not his own, or perhaps it was something from when he was too small to know. The hush pressed in. There was no voice, yet his mind shaped words from that intangible sense of presence. You are safe. Shaken, he stepped back. He wanted to speak, but he hesitated, conscious that any sound might shatter this fragile moment. He raised the torch again, glancing around to be sure no one else was there. The crypt remained lifeless, silent in the same way a forest can be silent when all the animals hide from an unseen predator. He was alone, yet not alone. He lingered, uncertain how long he stood there. Time slipped away with each flicker of the torch. At last, he set the torch into a bracket on the wall, so he could free his hands. The shadows retreated a fraction, replaced by the dim glow that revealed Lyanna's face, the shape of her stone wolf, and the corridor stretching behind him. He spoke softly, almost without intending to. "I'm sorry," he murmured, not sure for what or to whom. Perhaps he was apologizing for intruding. Perhaps for leaving her alone. Words tumbled from his thoughts, though he could not give them voice. He took another breath. Then he knelt before the statue, a gesture of respect he felt compelled to make. Despite any doubts about his lineage, about his place, something about her presence demanded reverence. Again, he sensed that shift in the air, a subtle swirl like a distant breeze. There was no draft he could see, yet the torch flame trembled as if stirred by something unseen. He glanced at it, uncertain whether to call out. He parted his lips, the shape of a question forming. But he caught himself. Asking a spirit to show itself might be madness. Instead, he remained silent, heart pounding, wishing he could hold this moment forever to better understand what it meant. He left the crypts only when the torch sputtered too low. The corridor seemed reluctant to let him go, as though the darkness pressed around him in protest. He told himself it was just his imagination. Still, when he emerged from below and entered the corridor leading to the great hall, the relief of the open space felt almost jarring. The heaviness in his limbs eased, replaced by a strange mix of wonder and dread. He swallowed and forced himself to return to his chamber, where he tried to lose himself in old training manuals. But his thoughts returned again and again to the silent figure carved from stone, and the intangible something that had touched him there. That night, he dreamt again. He drifted into a half-sleep under the firs, listening to the quiet crackle of the small hearth in his room. In the dream, he stood in the crypts without a torch. But there was light, a pale glow that outlined each statue. It came from no source he could see. It was as though the walls themselves emitted a soft, ghostly radiance. He walked slowly, the hush broken only by a faint murmuring. He could not make out words, but the tone was comforting. A lullaby in a voice warm and full of sorrow and love. He advanced until he saw Lyanna's statue. In the dream, she looked alive. Her features turned downward as though watching him approach. The direwolf at her feet also seemed to stir. He knelt, the way he had knelt in waking life, but in the dream, she reached toward him. Though her arm remained stone, there was a shimmer of light around the outline of her hand. A gentle warmth folded around him, protective as a mother's embrace. He woke with tears drying on his cheeks, though he did not remember crying in the dream. Outside, the sky was still black, with the barest hint of purple creeping along the horizon. He lay there for long minutes, heart thudding. He did not move to wipe his face, only blinked at the ceiling in the faint glow from the dying embers. He knew the sense of closeness he'd felt in that dream was no accident. Whether it was a fantasy conjured by his own desires or something real, he felt certain that Lyanna's spirit, some remnant of her love, had touched him. It was a dangerous thought, for no one spoke so openly of ghosts in Winterfell. But he couldn't dismiss it. Her presence felt too real to be dismissed as a child's fancy. Over the next few days, he continued his usual routine, training in the yard, tending to the stable when asked, receiving half nods from some of the men-at-arms as they passed him by. He tried to focus, going through the motions of sword drills, practicing with a wooden blade until his arms ached. At times he could lose himself in the repetition. Yet always, that quiet curiosity drew him. After the evening meal, when the sky had fully darkened, he would descend once more into the crypts, carrying a torch or a candle. Each time, the hush greeted him like an old friend, or an old secret. Once or twice he told himself he came just to clear his head, to chase away illusions by confronting them. But in truth, he longed for that wordless sense of solace, the faint swirl of air that seemed to whisper comfort. It did not come every time. Some nights, the crypts were dead in the truest sense of the word. Silent, lifeless, no presence beyond his own racing pulse. On those nights, he grew uneasy as he passed the line of statues, each visage stern in the flicker of his torch. He sometimes felt like a fool for expecting an echo or a vision. He wondered if he was losing his wits, searching for a ghost who had no cause to appear. But he kept returning. On certain nights, something subtle would shift. He'd sense that phantom breeze, a gentle swirl of air, or hear what could have been a soft sigh behind him. Always, when he spun around, the crypts were empty, yet the torch flame would dance, and his heartbeat would slow in response to some intangible reassurance. He would find himself standing before Lyanna's statue, gazing at her features and longing to know more, to understand. And each time he left, he felt a lingering warmth in his chest that lasted until dawn. He knew better than to speak of this to anyone. He suspected that if he told any of his siblings, or even the old maester, they would give him pitying looks, or blame it on an overactive mind. Even if someone believed him, the speculation could raise questions about his birth, about why he was feeling such an attachment to Ned's lost sister. Ned himself had been away on business for some time, traveling with Robb to see to matters in the local holdings. Caitlin, polite as she was in front of others, barely acknowledged him unless required, and Jon had no desire to share his odd experiences with her. He chose silence, and so the crypts became his private refuge, a secret vantage point from which he could sense something that felt more real to him than any sweet lie of acceptance upstairs. One afternoon, while sitting in the great hall with a bowl of stew, he glanced over to see Arya. She was seated at the far end of the table, picking at her food. When she met his gaze, she offered a shy sort of half-smile, and he found himself wondering if he could speak to her about the crypts. Arya was different from her sister Sansa, less concerned with courtesy and more prone to follow her own instincts. She might be open to the idea of something haunting the crypts. But then he dismissed the thought. Arya had enough on her mind, learning to navigate the expectations of her mother and everyone else. He would not burden her with tales of ghosts. Better to keep it to himself. He forced a small smile in return, and lowered his eyes to his stew, the steam curling above it with a meaty scent that turned his stomach more than it satisfied him. In the days that followed, that intangible pull grew stronger. He began to sense an undertone, like a quiet melody that wove itself through the corridors of Winterfell. He would catch it at odd moments. A hush in the library, a stillness in the armory, as if a gentle presence brushed against his peripheral awareness. He would turn, expecting to see someone behind him, only to find emptiness. At night, he no longer needed the dream to guide him to the crypts. He simply knew he must go. On one particular evening, with clouds covering the moon, he made his way down with a lantern instead of a torch. The flame inside the glass flickered a yellow glow against the damp walls as he carefully descended. The deeper he went, the stronger that quiet sense of expectancy grew, pulsing in the darkness like a heartbeat. When he reached Lyanna's tomb, he found fresh flowers lying before the statue. White winter roses, their petals as pale as new-fallen snow. He froze. He was certain they had not been there before. They looked newly placed, their stems still green, droplets of moisture on the leaves. Whose hand had left them? He did not think any other member of the household had come down recently. The crypt was seldom visited except on important days, or when Ned himself left tributes. But Ned was gone. Could it be a servant fulfilling an old tradition at Ned's request? Or was there something else at work? He knelt and reached out tentatively. The roses were real enough, the soft petals cold to the touch. For a moment, his mind strayed to the legend of Rhaegar Targaryen, crowning Lyanna Stark with winter roses at Harrenhal, a spark that lit the war that would change the Seven Kingdoms forever. He knew bits of the story from overheard conversations. Rhaegar, the silver-haired prince, had passed over his lawful wife and given the crown of beauty to Lyanna, a foolish or romantic gesture, depending on who told it. Whatever the truth, it ended in grief. Jon felt a pang in his chest. He had no right to mourn a woman he had never met, but something about that heartbreak resonated with him. "I don't know what to say," he whispered, almost expecting a reply. The air remained still. He set the lantern down gently on the stone floor, its golden glow flickering across the statue's features. "I wish I could have known you." His voice died in the darkness. But slowly, so subtly he might have imagined it. The air stirred with that familiar swirl. A hint of warmth brushed his cheek. A presence hovered at his shoulder, as though someone stood behind him, leaning in to hear his words. His heart pounded. He did not flee. He bowed his head, feeling a chill and warmth at once. He sensed the weight of the crypts around him, centuries of Starks, thousands of old bones. He could almost feel them listening, though not all with the same gentleness he felt from Lyanna. Some might be indifferent, others displeased. Yet her presence overshadowed everything. He closed his eyes, half expecting an unseen hand on his shoulder. Then the swirl of air moved in front of him, fluttering the petals of the white roses. In the dim lantern light, he watched as one rose shifted slightly, as though an invisible hand had nudged it closer to him. He swallowed, his throat tight, and lifted his gaze to the statue. The carven stone stared back with unchanging eyes. Yet he felt a focus, a warmth that whispered between the beats of his heart. He reached out and took one of the roses, holding it delicately in his hand. Its scent was faint but sweet, conjuring an echo of what might have been that woman's fragrance when she walked these halls in life. Jon felt tears threaten behind his eyes. He pressed his lips together, uncertain if grief or longing compelled him. Slowly he rose to his feet. The presence remained, watchful, expectant. He felt a tug in his chest, and an idea rose in him without warning, a desire to offer something in return. But he had no gift prepared, no memory or token to match the flowers. The only thing he could offer was a promise. Though he did not know to whom or what he would swear. He lifted the rose in his hand, gazing at it. "Thank you," he breathed. He could have sworn he felt something like a hand brushing against his cheek, though there was nothing there. Startled, he reached up. His skin tingled. The lantern's flame flickered wildly for a moment, as though shaken by an unseen force. Then it steadied, and the crypt stilled. Silence returned. Absolute. Leaving the lantern in place, he took a careful step away from the statue, half expecting something more. But the hush persisted. Reluctantly, he reclaimed the lantern and moved back down the passage. With each step away from Lyanna's tomb, he felt the presence recede, though it did not vanish entirely. It lingered at his back, as if reluctant to let him go. The corridor's darkness swallowed him, and soon he emerged into the upper levels, the flicker of the lantern now faint in the broader light from the torches near the great keep. He walked straight to his small room and closed the door behind him. His breaths were shallow as he set the lantern aside. He opened his hand to stare at the rose he still held. The petals had bruised slightly where his fingers had pressed, but it remained intact. He set it gently on a small table by his bed. A part of him wanted to discard it, as though it were cursed. But a deeper instinct told him to keep it safe, to honor the gift. So he laid it there, brushing the petals once with his fingertips. Then he banked the small fire in the hearth, removed his boots, and slipped under his blankets. He wanted sleep to take him, but his mind churned with questions. Who had left those flowers, if not her ghost itself? Was it truly possible that Lyanna's spirit was active here now, shielding him? And if so, why him? His dreams were dark again that night, but not frightening. He floated through images of an overgrown garden, winter roses nodding in the moonlight. He heard faint laughter, saw glimpses of a woman's face with gray eyes alight, turning toward him. And in one fragment of a dream, he stood near a tower lit by a crimson dawn, the wind blowing across a sandy plain. He heard whispers he could not decipher, saw silhouettes of men in armor. When the scene shifted, he was back in Winterfell's crypts, but this time, Lyanna's statue was gone. In its place stood a living figure cloaked in shadows, a direwolf at her side. She lifted her hand, beckoning him. He stepped closer, but before he could see her face, he woke to the gray light of early morning, heart pounding with unexplained urgency. A new sense of devotion filled him that day. He went about his tasks with more purpose, carefully feeding and grooming the horses, cleaning tack until the leather shone. He took up a wooden sword to practice footwork in the yard. The old master-at-arms watched him from a distance, nodding in approval as Jon landed each pivot and strike. If any of his siblings or the household guard noticed a change in him, they did not remark on it. But Jon felt that quiet strength in his limbs, as though some portion of Lyanna's fierce spirit had touched him. He had no illusions that it would make him the best swordsman, or that it would win him the acceptance he craved among the living. But it was a sense of belonging, if only in the shadows. He clung to that intangible comfort more fiercely than he cared to admit. When night came, he struggled with whether to return to the crypts. A part of him worried he was becoming obsessed, that he might anger her spirit or unearth secrets best left buried. Another part of him yearned for that closeness, that subtle warmth he felt there. In the end, he could no more resist the call of the crypts than he could stop breathing. Taking a torch this time, he made his way down once more. The chill met him like a silent host. He walked with cautious steps, a flicker of uncertainty in his heart. Yet, as he neared Lyanna's tomb, the hush embraced him, and he felt the tension ease from his shoulders. The roses were still there, laid in a neat arrangement upon the stone dais. Their petals had begun to wilt slightly, but they remained fragrant. Kneeling again, he set the torch aside in a bracket and placed his hand lightly on the carved direwolf at Lyanna's feet. The stone was cold under his palm. "You're watching over me, aren't you?" he murmured. "I can't explain why, but I feel as if you are." His words echoed in that still air. For several long moments, there was no response. He almost laughed at himself for expecting an answer. Then he felt a gentle ripple against his senses, like a mild wind brushing his face, though not strong enough to stir the torch's flame. For an instant, he sensed a sadness, a longing as vast as the northern sky. It felt like a mother mourning a lost child, or a sister mourning a brother. It was too deep to put into words. And behind that sorrow, a fierce protectiveness flared, a vow unspoken. He closed his eyes, letting that wave of emotion wash through him. In it, he sensed reassurance, as though she was telling him that she would stand guard if any darkness dared approach. And for a moment, Joan's eyes burned with tears again. It was not fear that drove the tears, but a sense of wonder and gratitude. He did not know what dangers might lie in his future, but the North was full of old powers, old legends, spirits that roamed the haunted forests and the icy wastes beyond the wall. Could it be so impossible that Lyanna Stark, a woman whose life had shaped the course of history, might linger in this place, bound by love or regret? He found the idea comforting, if a touch tragic. He stayed there a long while, not speaking further, merely resting in that silent communion. When at last he stood, every muscle in his legs stiff from kneeling, he looked upon her face. The statue's blank eyes revealed nothing, but the presence that clung to the air felt gentler now, as if soothed by his own acceptance. With a quiet nod of thanks, he retrieved the torch from its bracket. "Good night," he said softly, and then turned to go. The crypt's corridor seemed almost welcoming as he departed, the darkness less oppressive than before. Footfalls steady, he ascended, passing by the long line of other tombs. For once, the statues of kings and lords glowering in the gloom did not unnerve him. He felt as though he walked among silent allies, or at least among watchers who recognized him in some veiled way. Over the following weeks, Jon continued to balance his duties with these nightly visits. He did not always linger at Lyanna's tomb. Sometimes he would pause by other Starks, bowing his head in respect. He studied the old legends carved around their crypts, running his fingers along the ancient runes that described their deeds. Some had built castles, some had won great battles, some had ended monstrous threats. All of them in their own time had protected the North. He wondered if their spirits, too, roamed these halls. Yet none held the pull that Lyanna's did. On certain nights, the presence was faint, almost absent, as though she were attending to other matters. On other nights, it was strong enough to bring him to his knees in awe, as though the entire crypt glowed with the memory of a proud, fearless girl who had fought for what she believed in. He never heard an actual voice, never saw a material shape, yet the hush told him more than any voice could have. He came to think of her as a guardian not only for him, but perhaps for Winterfell itself. A woman who had died too young, with love and secrets locked in her heart, might well claim a silent vigil in these halls. When Ned and Robb returned from their journey, Jon tried to gauge Ned's mood, searching for any hint that he might share something about Lyanna. But Ned was the same as ever, reserved, kind but distant, as though weighed by responsibilities that no one else could fully comprehend. He spoke little of his trip, only that the watchtowers in the distant foothills needed extra rangers, and that matters in the realm were in flux. Jon wanted to ask him about the crypts, about Lyanna's memory, but the words lodged in his throat. How could he speak of spirits to the man who had raised him? A man who seldom shared more than practical wisdom or necessary secrets. That evening, while everyone else took their meal, Jon slipped away. He headed to the crypts, half hoping for that swirl of air to greet him, to give him the courage to speak to Ned about her. Yet as he descended, the darkness felt heavier, as though the gloom had thickened in his absence during the day. He reached Lyanna's tomb, only to find the wilted remains of the old roses, their petals browned and curled at the edges. The hush pressed around him, but it was different. There was a restlessness to the air, like the hush before a storm. He knelt, placing a hand on the dais. "I wish you could speak to me," he whispered. "I wish I knew what to do." The emptiness offered no reply, only that quiet heaviness. He almost thought something in the corridor moved, but when he lifted his head, he saw nothing but shadows. Days passed and the presence did not grow weaker, but it felt more somber. Jon continued to sense that protective watchfulness, yet it was tinged with anxiety. He had no idea what might trouble a spirit, if indeed it was Lyanna's spirit. The realm above was not at war, not openly, but tensions always simmered beneath the surface of the Seven Kingdoms. Sometimes, he imagined that she sensed danger in the future. He trained harder in the courtyard, dedicating himself to each sword swing, each stance, each parry. A voice inside him insisted that trouble was coming, that he must be ready. And whenever that voice flared, he felt a ghostly reassurance, as though Lyanna stood behind him, placing her hand lightly on his shoulder. One afternoon, as he panted from exertion in the yard, sweat dripping off his brow despite the northern chill, he glanced toward the tower where the spiral stairs led down toward the crypts. Just for an instant, he imagined a slim figure with dark hair leaning there, watching him with proud eyes. He blinked, and there was only a blank stone, but a sense of warmth filled him. He did not question it. And so, day by day, a silent bond formed. It did not replace the living relationships in Jon's life, nor did it erase the ache he felt at being a bastard, uncertain of his future. But it tempered his loneliness. In that quiet hour every night, he would descend, stand before Lyanna's tomb, and feel enveloped by her presence. Sometimes he spoke of his doubts or his small triumphs in the training yard. Sometimes he said nothing at all, content to be in that hush that knew him in ways none of the living ever had. And though no words answered him, the swirling air, the faint drift of warmth, the intangible stirring around the roses told him that she listened, that she cared in her own spectral fashion. Even in his dreams, the tower in the desert appeared again, though more fleeting. He saw glimpses of a great war raging in the distance. He heard the clash of swords. He felt a wave of sorrow so intense it robbed him of speech. And then there was the swirl of air, the faint breeze, like a gentle hush that carried him away from the horror. Always he came back to the crypts, to that slender shape carved in stone, guarding him. He woke each time with his heart racing, the taste of salt tears on his lips. Yet he was not afraid. He was only certain that something bigger than he could comprehend was at work. Something that bound his fate to the spirit of Lyanna Stark. One night, as he prepared to leave the crypts, he turned at the base of the stairwell leading up. He looked back over his shoulder, and for a breath, he saw a figure standing near Lyanna's statue. The lantern light did not reach far enough to reveal details, just a slim outline, pale in the darkness, like a flicker of moonlight in human form. His heart nearly stopped. He could make out no face, no eyes, only the suggestion of a shape, as though formed from mist. Then it was gone, the darkness filling in the space. A chill rippled through him, but not of fear, rather the shock of bearing witness to something beyond reason. He closed his eyes, breathed out, and murmured his thanks. When he opened them, there was nothing, but he felt that presence linger, and he brought the memory of it with him as he climbed out into the night air. Alone in his room, he sat on his bed, leaning his back against the cool stone wall, the furs around his waist. He gazed at the rose he had saved, now dried and brittle, pressed between the pages of an old volume. He recalled that fleeting shape by the statue, wondered if it was truly Lyanna's spirit, or merely a trick of the light. But in his gut he knew. He had felt her there, not in malice or with any unquiet thirst for vengeance, but with a protective, maternal longing. It made him question everything he believed about the afterlife and the old gods. Perhaps the old gods allowed some souls to linger for reasons beyond mortal understanding. If ever there was a soul with unfinished business, it would be Lyanna Stark, whose life and death had changed the destiny of the realm. As sleep claimed him, he whispered into the darkness, "Thank you for watching over me." Outside, the night wind swept across the battlements, rustling through the courtyard. Far below, in the crypts of Winterfell, The stone effigies remained still, but hidden among them, the hush breathed, waiting, guarding, holding the memory of promises made in blood and tears. And in that hush, a spirit lingered. A wolf maiden, a sister, a guardian, watching over Jon Snow with the unwavering devotion she had once offered those she loved in life. Even in death, she would not abandon him, for though the world might never know the truth of that bond, it shone like a single rose in an endless winter, delicate, fragile, and yet powerful enough to challenge the cold. So it went, night after night, day after day, each cycle weaving their connection more tightly. Jon could not foresee what storms might gather in the south, what shadows might loom beyond the wall, or what revelations might one day break upon him like a thunderclap. But in the silence of Winterfell's crypts, he had found a stalwart ally, a shield forged in spirit and love. And though her voice never rose above the hush, though her form never solidified beyond a ghostly flicker, Lyanna Stark stood watch in the darkness, offering comfort and courage to the boy who knew himself only as a bastard. And for Jon, that single truth mattered more than words. He was not alone, not truly. In the quiet hours, the spirit of Lyanna Stark guarded him, and in turn he carried her memory like a hidden flame against the deepening cold. Okay. Winter tightened its grip on Winterfell with each passing day. Subtle changes crept through the castle. The bark of the direwolves grew sharper at dusk. The stable fires were banked earlier, and the training yard seemed bleak under the pale, filtered sunlight. Jon felt the shift as much in his bones as in the air. It was the old way of the north, a slow withdrawal into the warmth of stone walls and thick firs, as if all living things braced for the deeper frosts still to come. Even so, he went about his duties with new determination, rising earlier each morning to start chores before the sun broke the horizon. The swirl of cold wind in the courtyard no longer fazed him. In a secret part of his mind, he thought of it as a pale echo of something else, a gentler swirl he had encountered in the crypts, one that called to him in a voice without sound. Days flowed into one another. He found no need to mark them, except by the length of the shadows at midday, and the drifting pace of the sun. The nights grew long, more so than usual this far north, and in those extended hours Jon lingered alone with his thoughts. Sometimes, after the evening meal, he would retreat to the library, where the ancient tomes whispered of the first men, the children of the forest, and the distant times of the long night. He pored over their crackling pages, imagining what it must have been like when winter swallowed the world in centuries past. Occasionally he stumbled upon references to ghostly presences or old gods that moved through the weirwoods, but rarely did he find mention of spirits haunting the tombs of the living. The Starks had always honored their dead with stoic silence, not fables of unrest. Still, he knew what he felt was real. Each night, as quietly as he could, he slipped down to the crypts once more. He moved like a shadow along the corridors, the flames of the torches along the walls flickering at his passing. In the darkness below Winterfell, he listened for that hush, that intangible sign that Lyanna Stark still watched over him. Sometimes the hush was immediate, as though she waited for him. Other times it crept in after a long spell of silence, like a shy creature emerging from the dark. He never doubted her presence now. It was something he understood with the clarity of breath. She was there, faint but unwavering. One bitterly cold evening, as the wind howled against the battlements above, Jon made his descent. He carried a single candle in a metal holder, its glow small and fragile. The flicker of light in the crypt was almost pitiful against the swallowing dark. But he preferred it that way. A torch sometimes felt too bright. Tonight, as he passed along the familiar row of stone lords and ladies, the candle revealed their faces in dim, quivering relief. Half of them seemed to frown at him, suspicious or aloof, but he did not linger on their judgments. His footsteps guided him to Lyanna's statue, as though drawn by a thread. He paused, candle held high. The air seemed colder than usual, pressing against him as though a door had opened to the winter sky. He shivered, pulling his cloak tighter, and stared at Lyanna's stone face. Despite the gloom, he imagined he saw a kindness in her carved expression. Again he remembered Ned's face when he placed flowers there, the deep sorrow in his eyes. Jon approached cautiously, unsure why he felt an odd hesitation. A prickle ran along his neck, the awareness that something was different. The hush felt taut, as if drawn tight by an unseen hand. He stepped closer, letting the candlelight fall across the dais. It illuminated the stone direwolf at Lyanna's feet. No flowers lay there tonight. The last had withered away days ago. Yet the moment he drew within arm's reach, he sensed movement in the dark. He jerked around, heart hammering, convinced someone stood behind him. But he saw no one, only the shapes of other statues looming in the corridor. Shadows quivered on the walls. He fought the urge to call out. Instead, he steadied himself, inhaled slowly, and lifted the candle so he could see better. There it was again, a shift of air, so delicate it barely stirred his hair. He whispered her name, though he had rarely dared to speak it aloud before. Lyanna. The hush returned, a little deeper this time, wrapping around him like a cloak. He felt a pulse of warmth in his chest, answer enough. Though no words were exchanged, he heard an echo of the unspoken vow he'd sensed that first night. You are safe. The tension in his muscles melted away. He took a breath, carefully set the candle in a small niche on the crypt wall, and lowered himself to kneel on the cold stone floor. I wish I could truly talk to you, he said softly. I don't know what you'd say back, but sometimes I feel... No, I know you hear me. He swallowed. The candlelight danced over Lyanna's statue, lending a faint glimmer to the carved lines of her hair. I've never had a mother. I had a father of sorts, but it isn't the same. I wonder if this is what it feels like, to have someone look at you with warmth. Even if you're... He hesitated to say the word dead. Instead, he bowed his head. Forgive me if I'm a fool. A trick of the cold air seemed to pass over him again, gentler this time. He dared to lift his eyes. In the shifting shadows, the statue's face looked almost tender. The stirring hush pressed closer, a faint swirl around his shoulders. He swallowed hard, his throat tight with emotion he couldn't name. It was a longing for something he'd never had. A family's unconditional love. Even after all these years, he recognized that yearning within himself. But here in the darkness, it did not feel so unattainable. He stayed that way for long minutes, silent, letting the closeness of her presence fill the emptiness. When at last he rose, the coldness of the stone floor had stiffened his legs. He retrieved the candle from the niche, noticing how the flame had burned low. Time had slipped by quickly. Before he turned to leave, he placed his hand against the statue's base, where the direwolf's paws were carved. His fingers brushed a thin layer of dust. In a soft voice he whispered, "Good night." He thought he felt an echo, an unspoken farewell in return. Then the hush receded as he took up his candle and left. That night, his dreams came swiftly. He was in a swirling storm of snow. The flakes cut across his vision in a blinding flurry, and when he tried to move, the drifts reached his knees. Yet there was no bitter chill. Instead, there was warmth coming from somewhere ahead. He forced himself onward, calling out, though he didn't know to whom. Shapes of tall trees rose around him, branches laden with snow. It might have been the wolf's wood, or someplace further beyond the wall. Then, in the midst of the swirling white, he saw a figure. Tall, cloaked in a gown that billowed like clouds. Her face was veiled by the falling flakes, but he sensed it was her, Lyanna, or her spirit. She reached out as if urging him forward. Then the dream shifted abruptly, and he was in the crypts, standing before her statue once again. A single candle flickered on the dais, but the crypt was half filled with water, reflecting torchlight and ripples on the ceiling. He heard voices echoing through the corridors, distant, panicked. He started to run, water sloshing around his ankles, trying to find the source of the voices. A thunderous roar filled his ears. He woke with his heart pounding, sweat clinging to his brow, the faint moonlight illuminating his chamber. For a moment, he sat up in bed, disoriented. The dream's final roar echoed in his mind. But there was only the hush of Winterfell's night, and the slow shuffle of a guard, making his rounds in the courtyard below. Jon leaned against the headboard, breathing hard. It was not the first time his dreams featured glimpses of something dire: water in the crypts, the swirling storm, an impending sense of chaos. He could not guess if it was a simple nightmare or a warning. The old god spoke in riddles, some said. Was it possible that in these silent visits, Lyanna was trying to convey something? He had no answer. In the following days, he threw himself into training. The master-at-arms took note of his growing skill, pairing him with more competent sparring partners. Jon's arms ached at night, and bruises blossomed on his ribs, shoulders, thighs. Yet he endured it all, driven by an internal fire. Sometimes, on the brink of exhaustion, he felt that quiet, supportive presence again, the memory of warmth in the crypt. It gave him the last flicker of resolve he needed to keep fighting. It spurred him to perfect every swing and stance, to land every blow precisely. That secret sense of guardianship lent his movements a fluid confidence that he once lacked. He saw fleeting surprise in the eyes of some onlookers when he bested them, and it only made him push himself harder. He remained cautious, though, to guard his nightly excursions. One evening, as he made his way to the door leading downstairs, he nearly collided with Arya, who was creeping about for reasons of her own, likely to avoid the sewing lessons that exasperated her. Jon froze, pulse jumping. She blinked at him, her gray eyes curious. "Where are you off to?" she asked, voice barely above a whisper. He forced a shrug. "Just needed some air." She narrowed her eyes. "You're heading the wrong way if you want fresh air. That goes to the crypts." He swallowed, searching for a plausible lie. Arya was not easily fooled. He cleared his throat, struggling for something to say. Her gaze flicked past him to the shadowy stairwell, then back to him. He braced himself, half expecting her to press the matter. But Arya surprised him. Her features, often so determined, softened. She looked at the darkness behind him and said nothing about it. Instead, she reached up, giving him a gentle poke in the arm with her small finger. "Don't let the dead bite," she teased quietly, but there was no malice in her grin. Then, barefoot as a cat, she slipped away down the corridor, leaving Jon standing there with relief and a strange hint of gratitude. She might have suspected he was up to something secret, but she hadn't forced him to explain. That night, his visit to the crypts was briefer. The presence felt subdued, as though weary. He wondered if he, too, might become a burden, always returning with his longing. He tried to speak less, instead simply standing before Lyanna's statue, hand resting lightly on the carved dire wolf. A peculiar image passed through his mind. An image of a young woman in a cloak of gray fur, mounted on a horse, her eyes blazing with fierce determination. He felt a pang in his chest, perhaps a memory, or a dream, or something the presence allowed him to glimpse. Then was gone, replaced by the familiar hush and an overwhelming sense of love and regret. "Thank you," he whispered again, his consistent farewell. Then he left, ascended the stairs, and found his bed with an odd mixture of sorrow and comfort warring in his heart. As the weeks stretched on, the tension in the castle rose. Whispers abounded that new unrest brewed in the south. Jon heard them from the servants who cleaned the halls or from the guards who lingered in the courtyard after training. The realm's peace was tenuous. Ned himself seemed increasingly preoccupied. On some mornings, Jon saw him in the great hall, brow furrowed in quiet reflection, as if wrestling with decisions he could not share. Catelyn Stark walked beside her husband with a poised air, but her glance sometimes drifted toward Jon with a flicker of unease, as if she sensed something about him shifting. Yet no one spoke openly of it, and so the tension remained a faint undercurrent. Winterfell continued its daily life. Bustling kitchens, practicing swordsmen, the clatter of wooden plates and cups in the hall. But each evening, Jon slipped away once more, drawn by the silent bond he shared with Lyanna Stark. In that hush, he felt more whole than in the bright clamor above. If the realm indeed stood on the brink of troubles, perhaps she would guide him, or at least give him solace. The crypts had become his place of reflection, a corner of the world where he could unravel the knot of doubt in his heart. He began noticing small changes around Lyanna's tomb. On some nights, the dais seemed scrubbed clean of dust, though he had never done so himself. Other times, fresh winter roses appeared, always white, sometimes only one or two, sometimes a small bundle. They carried that faint scent that stirred his memory in ways he could not fully explain. He suspected Ned might have been responsible, or a servant under Ned's orders. Yet, on a few occasions, Ned was away, and no servant had come down during the day. Jon asked discreet questions, but none admitted to leaving flowers. He decided with a strange certainty that Lyanna's spirit could manifest them when her love swelled beyond the boundaries of death. Such things were whispered in old stories, the dead occasionally leaving tokens as they lingered. Perhaps it was merely superstition, but Jon embraced the notion wholeheartedly. One night, the hush was particularly strong. It felt almost tangible, pressing around him as he approached the crypt with a half-spent torch in his hand. His skin tingled with an awareness that stretched the length of his spine. Instead of proceeding straight to Lyanna's statue, he paused at the threshold of the corridor, scanning the darkness. A flicker of motion caught his eye. His breath caught in his throat. Far down the row of statues, beyond where his torchlight could clearly reach, something glimmered faintly, as though moonlight reflected on water. He stepped forward, cautious, each footfall echoing. The presence felt intense, urging him not to be afraid. As he drew nearer, the dim contours of an outline came into view. It was nearly shapeless, but enough that he perceived a woman's form. Slender, shoulders draped in what could have been a cloak. The edges flickered like a reflection on disturbed water. His heart pounded so fiercely he could scarcely keep hold of the torch. Every instinct told him this was Lyanna's spirit made visible. The air chilled further, but not with dread. Rather, it felt like the hush of an ancient forest. A hush that preceded a profound revelation. He took another step, mouth dry. She remained there for a single breath. 2, 3. Then, as though the shadows themselves swallowed her, she faded. Jon let out the breath he'd been holding, a tight sob catching in his throat. He had seen her. He was certain of it, even if only for a moment. The hush enveloped him then, wrapping around his senses with that same protective gentleness. He did not run, did not cry out. Instead, he felt tears gather in his eyes, unbidden, and blinked them away. He wanted to speak, to call her name, to beg her not to vanish. But she was gone, leaving a trace of moonlit afterimage in the corridor. In the aftermath of that encounter, he sank to his knees before Lyanna's statue and tried to catch his breath. The torch sputtered, throwing wild shadows on the walls. He murmured broken words of gratitude and confusion, certain she understood even if he could not articulate the questions that threatened to overwhelm him. The presence remained close, a balm on his racing heart. When he finally stood again and climbed back to the upper halls, the castle seemed oddly vibrant, as if he had spent hours in the crypts rather than mere minutes. He barely slept that night, replaying that glimpse in his mind, half wishing he could paint it or record it in some lasting way. But it belonged to the darkness. In the days that followed, that memory became a source of quiet strength. Whenever he sparred and felt near his limit, the vision of that softly outlined figure came to him. He would draw a fresh breath, push beyond his pain, and find success in maneuvers that had eluded him before. His sword arm felt steadier, his footwork swifter. The old master-at-arms grunted approval more than once, calling him promising. Yet Jon felt no arrogance in that praise. He recognized that some ephemeral grace guided him, not skill alone. If anything, it humbled him further, an awareness that he was the beneficiary of a love that transcended understanding. Yet as the nights stretched into weeks, he could not shake the foreboding sense from his dreams. The swirling snow, the roar in the crypts, the water rising. The storms in his sleep seemed to escalate, leaving him breathless by morning. He found himself eyeing the horizon whenever he walked the battlements, noticing how the skies to the north seemed darker, more brooding. Was it mere weather, or a sign of worse things? He did not know. He sometimes wanted to confide in someone. Robb, maybe, or Maester Luwin. But the words stuck in his throat. For how could he explain that he dreamt of prophecies from a ghost? One evening, as twilight bled across the sky in streaks of purple and red, Jon was summoned by Ned. He found him in the solar, a small fire crackling in the fireplace. Ned stood near a narrow window, arms folded, gazing down at the courtyard with a pensive expression. Jon paused at the threshold, uncertain. Ned glanced over his shoulder, motioning him forward. "You've been training hard," Ned said softly. "I have seen you in the yard." Jon dipped his head in acknowledgement. "Yes, my lord." Ned exhaled. The corners of his mouth turned down in that hint of sorrow that always seemed to lurk behind his eyes. "I'm not blind, Jon. I see the changes in you. I also see that you spend more time alone these days, hardly even share a table with your siblings." Jon said nothing, uncertain how to answer. It was true, he avoided the family's gatherings when he could, half out of discomfort, half out of a desire to keep his secret visits hidden. Ned turned fully, resting a hand on the hilt of his sword in a gesture of habitual comfort. "I want you to know," he continued, "that if something troubles you, I'm here to listen. I can't promise I'll have the answers, but I will listen." Jon's throat tightened. He almost spoke of the Crypts right then, of the spirit he believed was Lyanna. But the words tangled. Would Ned believe him? And if he did, would it burden him with regrets or suspicions? Jon glanced at the floor. "I'm fine, my lord. There's not much to say." A flicker of disappointment passed over Ned's features. Yet he didn't press. Instead, he nodded. "Very well. But keep your eyes open, especially in the yard. I've told them to start using live steel more often now that winter's close. I want to ensure you aren't pushed too hard." Jon blinked. "I can handle it." Ned regarded him with a measuring gaze. A memory of sorrow crossed his face, though Jon could not guess its source. Then Ned sighed. "I know you can." He managed a tight smile. "Go on then. Get some rest." Jon left the solar feeling a pang of guilt. Ned had tried to reach out, in his own guarded way. But Jon couldn't bring himself to share. He told himself that perhaps one day he would. One day, he might find the right moment to reveal that a presence in the crypts watched over him, that he believed it to be Ned's own sister. For now the secret seemed too precious and too uncertain to risk exposing. He pushed those thoughts aside and returned to his daily tasks, hoping that the quiet tension would ease on its own. Still, the conversation left him unsettled. That night, he descended once again, candle in hand, determined to find comfort in Lyanna's presence. The hush greeted him readily, enveloping him as he approached. No ghostly figure appeared this time, but the sense of watchfulness remained. He felt it most strongly as he stood before her statue, almost as if she reached out to him through the stone, some intangible bond bridging life and death. For a moment, he closed his eyes, letting his breath deepen. He wished he could speak openly, tell her of the guilt he felt, of Ned's concern. He whispered, "Maybe I should tell him. Would that make things right?" But no answer came. Only the hush, as always, warm and sorrowful, and full of unspoken love. He lingered until his candle burned dangerously low, casting him into near darkness. Then he made his way back up, footsteps careful. When he emerged into the corridor, he nearly ran into a figure waiting at the top of the stairs. His candle sputtered as he froze, heart leaping to his throat. But it was only a servant, one of the older women who worked in the kitchens. She startled as well, stepping back quickly. "Oh, Seven save me, lad. I didn't hear you there." She peered at the candle. "The Crypts? It's late to be wandering there alone?" Jon forced a smile. "I was just looking for her. Quiet." She nodded slowly, a flicker of concern in her eyes. "Hey, the Crypts are quiet enough." Her voice lowered. "But be mindful, child. The dead can be restless at times. Best not to court them too often." A kindly warning, lightly spoken. Then she offered a small curtsy and hurried past him down the corridor, leaving Jon with a renewed sense that his nightly visits were not so secret as he'd hoped. Word traveled fast in the castle. The last thing he wanted was for Caitlin or the others to question his presence among the dead. That would lead to questions he couldn't answer. He returned to his chamber and slipped under the furs. Darkness pressed in around him. The candle had nearly gutted itself. and he set it aside carefully. Long after the flame died, he lay awake, listening to the faint sigh of wind against the shutters. His thoughts spun in circles. Ned's concern, the servant's warning, Arya's narrow-eyed curiosity. He felt torn between his need for that spectral bond and the risk of drawing attention. Yet the hush beckoned him each night with an almost maternal pull. How could he abandon it? It was the only place he felt wholly accepted, that intangible love bridging the gulf he felt in life. The next morning, the sky was iron gray, promising sleet or perhaps a bitter flurry. Jon ate quickly, then hurried to help with the stable tasks. The horses were restless, stamping in their stalls. He worked alongside a few other hands to calm them, speaking quietly as he brushed their coats. His mind was only half on his work, the other half wandering to the crypts yet again. After lunch, he took to the yard, practicing with live steel under the watchful eye of the master-at-arms. The ring of metal against metal filled the courtyard, echoing off the walls as he and another young man circled each other. Jon lost himself in the dance of swordplay, channeling both his discipline and that ghostly confidence into his movements. He came away with a shallow cut on his left forearm, but he had earned a nod of approval from the trainer. That evening, as he considered venturing downstairs again, he found an unexpected visitor in the corridor near his chamber. Sansa thought, "Oh." She looked a bit lost, fiddling with the sleeve of her gown. When Jon approached, she seemed startled, her posture stiffening. They rarely spoke directly, both uncertain of how to bridge the awkwardness that came from their different stations in the household. She cleared her throat softly. "Good evening," she said in a polite tone. He returned a short bow. "Good evening." Sansa hesitated, glancing behind her as though making sure no one else was around. "I was looking for Arya. She ran off after supper. Have you seen her?" Jon shook his head. "Not recently. She might be in the armory, pestering them for arrow tips again." "Memonitor?" Sansa sighed, smoothing her skirts. "Likely so." She offered him a faint, guarded smile. "I'm sorry to bother you." Then she turned to leave, pausing only briefly as if she wanted to say more. She did not, and her footsteps clicked on the stone floor, growing distant. Jon watched her go, wondering what she thought of him, wondering if any of his siblings ever suspected he found refuge among the dead each night. He felt a pang of isolation. Even though Arya could be friendly, Robb had moments of camaraderie, and Bran sometimes looked up to him. There was still that invisible barrier. He was a bastard, never quite one of them. He gritted his teeth, deciding he would not let that weigh on him now. The hush below waited, a comfort to him. Perhaps it was dangerous or foolish to cling to it, but it was also the one space where he felt wholly seen. He made his way down near midnight, torch in hand. This time, the crypts felt more oppressive than usual. Cold air clung to the stones, and water dripped somewhere in the distance. A slow, rhythmic plink that set his nerves on edge. He walked past the earlier tombs until he reached Lyanna's. The hush emerged at once, though it bore a somber note. There was no swirl of warmth, no tender stirring of air. Instead, he felt a tension, as if Lyanna's spirit braced for something. He set his torch aside, leaning it carefully against the wall, where it cast a long, flickering glow across the statue's face. In that light, her features took on a stern cast, the gentle lines overshadowed by the interplay of light and shadow. Jon's heart thumped heavily. "What's wrong?" he asked quietly, though he knew she would not answer in words. Yet he felt it, an urgency that pressed against his senses, a warning in the hush. Like a sudden, sharp wind before a storm. A low moan of air drifted through the corridor, resonating eerily. For an instant, Jon's mind conjured the dream of the rising water, the echoing roar. He wondered if the crypts themselves anticipated a calamity. He laid a hand on the stone direwolf, feeling its cold solidity under his palm. "Are you trying to show me something?" he asked, his voice echoing in the darkness. The hush persisted. A faint swirl teased the flame of the torch, making it bend and sputter. Shadows leapt across the walls as if alive. Jon swallowed, fighting a wave of unease. But in the tension, he still sensed her protectiveness. He closed his eyes, letting out a shaky breath. "I don't know what's coming," he murmured. "But if there's something I should do, if you can guide me, I'll listen." He stood there, poised on the edge of a question no one could answer. Then, so faintly he almost missed it, he heard a soft scrape of stone behind him. He whirled, torch in hand, thinking perhaps a statue had shifted, or a rat scurried by. But nothing moved. The corridor stretched empty, only darkness beyond the torchlight. He turned back to Lyanna's statue, heart pounding. The hush remained, watchful, urging him to stay alert. He felt as if he stood in the presence of a restless sentinel, a spirit that could feel a disturbance in the very air. He forced himself to remain a few minutes longer, despite the prickle on his skin. Nothing else happened. No further noises, no flickers of ghostly shape. Eventually, the tension lessened, replaced by the same sorrowful tenderness he associated with Lyanna. He took a slow breath, feeling that intangible presence calm, as though she herself realized he was frightened and sought to soothe him. Tiredness washed over him then, a wave of profound fatigue. He dipped his head in silent farewell and made his way back to the upper floors, each step echoing in the quiet. By the time he reached his chamber, he could hardly keep his eyes open. He fell onto his bed fully clothed, curling into the furs. A swirl of half-formed thoughts accompanied him into sleep. The hush, the warning, the tension that hovered in the darkness. He dreamt again of water flooding the crypts, but this time it was scattered with white petals that drifted on the current. He saw them swirl around Lyanna's statue, caught in an eddy, then fade into the murk. When he woke at dawn, a knell of dread clung to him. The castle stirred early that day, and he soon learned why. A raven had arrived with ominous tidings from the south. There was talk of new hostilities, political strife in King's Landing, rumors that might well draw Ned Stark away from Winterfell again, or plunge the realm into uncertain conflict. Jon listened to the hushed gossip in the courtyard, the stable, the great hall. He felt that spark of warning deep in his bones, recalling the charged hush in the crypts. Was this what Lyanna's spirit sensed? A shadow looming over her kin. He did not know how events would unfold. He had no plan, no means to influence such grand affairs. Yet the hush had planted a seed of resolve in his heart. If winter truly brought war or chaos, he would stand ready, no matter what name he bore, or whose blood ran in his veins. He would fight for his adopted family, if it came to that, and for the North. And, in those hidden hours beneath Winterfell, he knew Lyanna's spirit would be at his side, unseen but steadfast. So the days continued, the hush never fully leaving him. Even as talk of letters and alliances spread, even as Ned gathered maesters and counselors for urgent meetings, Jon felt that unearthly companionship. In the practice yard, in the stables, in the hallways at dusk, he glimpsed the intangible flicker at the corners of his vision. A presence that reminded him he was not alone. And each night, in the crypts, he knelt before the statue with cautious reverence, half expecting some new sign. The swirl of air would come, or a subtle shift in the candle flame, or even the phantom fragrance of winter roses. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would prove to anyone else that Lyanna guarded him, but enough to reaffirm what he already knew in his heart. One evening, as he pressed a fresh candle into a bracket near her tomb, he sensed a tenderness in the hush that nearly brought him to tears. It wrapped around him like an embrace. Without warning, he found himself recalling a lullaby he had overheard once, long ago, the kind that northern mothers sang to their children about brave little wolves venturing into the snowy woods. He hummed a broken fragment of that tune under his breath, a gentle, halting melody that echoed faintly in the darkness. He felt silly at first, but as the hush embraced him, the melody came more confidently. For a moment, it seemed as though the hush harmonized with his voice, resonating in his chest. When he finished, the crypt fell utterly silent. He bowed his head, cheeks flushed, heart beating hard. In that silence, he thought he felt a touch on his shoulder, like a hand ghosting across his cloak. He shivered, not from cold, but from awe. A moment passed in stillness before he rose to his feet. He blew out a shaky breath, feeling both comforted and raw. The presence pulsed around him one last time, then receded, leaving a faint warmth in the air. He realized with a start that tears had wet his cheeks. He brushed them away, reluctant to leave but unsure what more to do. He returned to his room, the lullaby still playing in his mind. For the first time in many nights, sleep claimed him without the usual nightmares of flood or storm. Instead, he dreamt of Lyanna guiding him through a quiet wood, the paths lit by soft starlight. He did not see her face, but he heard laughter echo between the trees, light and free, like the laughter of a beloved sister. And he felt safe, truly safe, in a way he had never felt before. When dawn came, he carried that sense of peace into the day. There were still rumors swirling in Winterfell about the South, about tensions with the crown, about lords who might need to gather. But Jon faced it all with a steady calm. Something deeper than fear sustained him. His chores became more than chores. They were a way to keep the fortress running, to uphold the honor of the house that sheltered him. His practice in the yard became not just training, but a vow to be strong in case his skill was ever needed. And each night, the crypts remained his sacred refuge, the place where Lyanna's spirit guarded him. Time slipped by, measured in the changing temperature of the halls and the approach of the northern nights, which grew ever longer. Sometimes Jon felt as if he lived two lives, one above, where he was the bastard training among the legitimate sons, taking meals in silence, nodding politely to Lady Catelyn's guarded glances, and one below, where he was no longer alone, where the hush welcomed him with a mother's love and a sister's gentle strength. That quiet duality shaped him more than he realized. As winter's edge grew sharper, the hush seemed to intensify in the crypts, as if Lyanna's spirit felt the deepening cold, and drew closer to him. There were nights when he thought he heard faint whispering, an echo of some old sorrow or promise, but he could never quite make out the words. Other times, he saw shapes in the gloom, reflections of a figure that might have been her, but they vanished if he tried to approach. Always, though, there remained that unwavering guardianship that had become his secret cornerstone. He relied on it like breath, certain that as long as Lyanna watched over him, he would not falter in whatever trials lay ahead. Yet, there were moments when he worried that he clung too tightly to the dead, that such devotion might blind him to the living who still cared for him in their own ways. He tried to bridge the gap with his siblings, offering to help Arya with her balancing exercises, sparring with Robb in friendly bouts. He shared a few quiet words with Bran about the art of climbing, though he advised caution. Bran only grinned mischievously. These small gestures felt like attempts to ground himself in life above the crypts, to remember that he was not just a child of shadow, but also part of Winterfell's daily heartbeat. And in those small moments, the hush within him burned brighter, as if Lyanna approved. So the days turned to weeks, and the hush wove itself into Jon's existence like a hidden tapestry thread. No one else asked him why he sometimes smelled faintly of musty air late at night, or why he would slip back into his chamber when the castle was quiet. Either they did not notice, or they chose to leave him be. Ned continued to watch him with that gentle but distant gaze, as if he sensed unspoken truths swirling around his son and could not bring himself to pry. For that, Jon was grateful. He wanted the question to come from within, not forced out by others. Still, the hush gave him no clarity on the future. It merely enveloped him in a silent vow, that if and when darkness came, if and when fate demanded some great test, he would not face it alone. Lyanna's spirit was with him, bound by love and sorrow and secrets that might never be fully revealed. Each time he knelt before her statue, he felt the weight of that promise pressing on his heart, urging him to stand strong for what was right and true. He stood at the edge of possibilities, the looming shadows of winter and politics converging in distant corners of the realm. He knew not what shape his life would take. All he knew was that in the crypts of Winterfell, a spirit lingered, fierce, sorrowful, unbreakable, and it guarded him like a mother wolf. He felt it in the hush. He saw it in the flicker of candlelight and the delicate white roses that sometimes appeared on the dais. He carried it with him into the yard, into his restless dreams, into every corner of his mind. And for now, in that stillness, it was enough. He was Jon Snow, and Lyanna Stark's spirit watched over him, a bond no cold wind or uncertain future could sever. Now, Kay. The wind beneath the walls whistled in a plaintive note as the days in Winterfell grew shorter, the air colder. Snow dusted the courtyard each dawn, thin and crisp, melting into slush by midday. The castle's daily business went on. Stew simmered in great pots. Hammers rang on steel in the smithy, and winter provisions were stacked in storerooms with quiet urgency. Whispers traveled through the corridors about changing plans. Some said Ned Stark would ride south soon, that the king's business required him. Others insisted it was only rumor. Jon listened, uncertain. He noticed how often Ned consulted with Maester Luwin in private, and how the Master-at-Arms paid extra attention to Robb's sword training. All signs seemed to confirm that trouble brewed in the realm. Jon's own sense of disquiet grew alongside the hush he carried in his heart. In those hours when he descended into the crypts, the presence he believed to be Lyanna's felt more vigilant, as though searching for something hidden in the darkness. She never appeared in full shape again. He didn't glimpse that fleeting, moonlit figure, yet her presence touched him with quiet intensity every time he knelt by her statue. He sometimes felt that if he turned too quickly, he might see her standing just beyond the edge of his torchlight, gray eyes filled with the sadness and fierceness that rumors said she had in life, but she remained, as ever, a half-glimpsed guardian in the corners of his perception. He spoke to her more openly now. When the hush around him thickened, he would share his worries. About Ned possibly leaving, about his own uncertain future in Winterfell, about the dreams that continued to haunt him. One such dream jolted him awake in the blackness before dawn. He sat up, the furs clinging to his sweaty chest, breath ragged. The dream had started in the crypts, quiet and familiar. Then he had heard the clang of swords echoing through the corridors. A man's voice called out, laced with desperation, though Jon couldn't discern the words. Water flooded the floor again, swirling around the tombs. Statues crumbled, and in the midst of the destruction he saw a single white rose floating on the dark water, spinning slowly as if caught in a whirlpool. The rose's petals turned red at the edges, as if stained with blood. Jon had tried to reach it, but the current tugged him under. He woke gasping, chest tight, heart hammering like a blacksmith's mallet against an anvil. He dressed quickly, pulling on a tunic and cloak, not wanting to remain in his bed with the dream's echo so fresh. The castle was still asleep. Only a few guards patrolled the battlements. Slipping from his room, he navigated the corridors by memory until he reached the steps down. He hadn't planned to visit the crypts at this hour, but the hush felt like an anchor drawing him. A single torch in hand illuminated his way. He could smell the damp chill that always lingered below, the centuries-old air that never fully circulated. At the bottom, his footsteps echoed in the corridor. Night lingered heavily here. No natural light, only the faint glow from his torch dancing across the carved faces of the old Stark statues. He passed the likenesses of Lord Rickard Brandon, others he hardly remembered by name. His torch revealed them in quick flashes, each face molded from stone in an unchanging solemnity. At last, he reached Lyanna's tomb. He felt her presence rush forward to greet him. No gentleness now, but a quiet anxiety that matched his own hammering pulse. He set the torch in a bracket on the wall. The flame jittered, casting elongated, wavering shadows. Lyanna's statue loomed above, pale in the flicker, the stone direwolf at her feet like a crouching sentinel. "I dreamed again," Jon whispered, though his voice sounded loud in the hush. There was water. Everything was falling apart. He paused, swallowing. He glanced around as if expecting an answer in the gloom. Instead, the hush pressed in, intense and watchful. "I don't know what you're trying to warn me about," he continued, words tumbling forth. "I only know that it felt like death, or war, or something awful, like the world was cracking open." He bowed his head, breathing shakily. A faint swirl of air moved past his cheek. It was cold but strangely comforting, as though urging him to calm. When he inhaled, the hush seemed to ease a fraction, letting him catch his breath. He wondered if Lyanna's spirit could sense the dream's grip on his mind, sense how deeply it disturbed him. Even in death, she remained stubbornly protective. So the stories said. He knew she could not simply lift the burden from him, but he felt her urging him not to give in to despair. After a few moments, he stood, forcing his shoulders back. "All right," he said softly. "I'm all right." He looked into the stone face. "Thank you." He lingered, uncertain if he should remain or leave. The hush fluttered around him, then slowly receded as if giving him space. He retrieved his torch, heart still beating hard, and climbed out of the crypts. By the time he reached the top of the stairs, a dim gray light announced the approach of dawn. He slipped back to his chamber, convinced no one had seen him, though the faint echo of footsteps overhead suggested some early risers were about. Later that morning, the news broke like a thunderclap. A raven had arrived from King's Landing. The king, Robert Baratheon, would travel north, planning to visit Winterfell. The household erupted with commotion. Servants spoke of lavish feasts and formal receptions. The master-at-arms prepared the men to stage a great tournament of sorts, or at least some displays of skill in the yard. Maids bustled through the halls, searching for linens, polishing silver, airing out guest chambers. This caused a stir that overshadowed everything else for a time. Jon listened, perched on the edges of conversations, gleaning bits of detail. The king was bringing a large entourage, knights and lords from the south. The castle had to be readied at once. Jon felt a strange tangle of excitement and dread. He had never met Robert Baratheon, though he knew that the king had been close to Ned in the days of rebellion, that Robert had been betrothed to Lyanna. That knowledge brought an odd ache. Perhaps Robert's presence would stir old ghosts in the crypts, literally or figuratively. Jon recalled the hush, the anxious swirl he'd felt from Lyanna's spirit these last weeks. Could this visit be the beginning of the trouble she sensed? He found no answer in the bustle of the day. For hours, everyone in Winterfell was pressed into service. Jon helped run messages, fetched supplies from the storerooms, even assisted with the grooming of the horses. He stayed clear of Lady Catelyn, who seemed particularly tense, issuing crisp orders for bed linens and table placements. Robb took on more duties as well, ensuring the men-at-arms were prepared to receive high-ranking visitors. Sansa and Arya, each in their own ways, were made to practice courtesy and attire. Amid all this, the hush in Jon's heart never fully faded. He felt it thrumming with intensity whenever his mind wandered to Lyanna's tomb. He told himself he would visit later, once the day's demands were done. But that night was not his own. A visiting party arrived unexpectedly early, only a handful of lords from the Neck, traveling ahead of the royal procession to announce the king's approach. Lord Eddard held a small gathering in the Great Hall to welcome them, and though Jon usually kept to the fringes, he had to remain visible, assisting in small tasks. By the time he was free, it was too late and too risky to disappear below. The crypts would have to wait. Instead, he found a quiet corner near the library to sleep, away from the newly arrived visitors who filled the corridors with loud conversation and the reek of sweaty horses. He drifted off, hoping his dreams would not torment him. For 2 more days, the castle braced itself. King Robert was mere leagues away, traveling slowly with all the grandeur of his court. Sansa chattered about how handsome knights might be in shining armor. Arya rolled her eyes whenever she heard Sansa's excitement. Bran was so eager to see the king's entourage that he barely sat still for a moment, climbing wherever he could for a better vantage. Jon kept to his tasks, uneasy about so many new people. He managed a single short visit to the crypts on the second evening. The hush enveloped him the instant he descended. Lyanna's presence felt calmer than before, as though she understood all was in motion now. He whispered that the king was coming, the man who once loved her, or claimed to. The hush fluttered in response, a swirl of sorrow perhaps or acceptance. He stayed only long enough to feel the warmth of her presence, then hurried back to keep from arousing suspicion. On the third day, just after midday, the horns rang out across the battlements. The king had arrived. The courtyard filled with commotion as the royal party entered through Winterfell's gates, horses in gleaming barding, banners snapping in the crisp northern wind. Jon watched from the side, overshadowed by the more legitimate members of the Stark household. He caught sight of Robert Baratheon. A broad man with a thick beard, his once muscular frame gone soft, yet carrying himself with a boisterous authority. He wore the black and gold of his house, his face splitting into a wide grin when he dismounted to greet Ned. The two men embraced, old friends reunited. The murmurs among the onlookers suggested that Robert had come to the north, not only to see Ned, but possibly with another grand design. Some whispered about a match between houses, or even the notion that Ned might be asked to serve as Hand of the King. Jon gleaned bits of these rumors without fully understanding their import. He felt a tremor in his chest when Robert turned to greet Lady Catelyn, and then each of the Stark children in turn. Robb, Sansa, Bran, Arya, and even Rickon, though the boy clung to his mother's skirts. Jon stood at a distance. When Robert's gaze skimmed over him, it was with a flicker of mild curiosity, quickly replaced by disinterest. Jon was accustomed to it, yet he couldn't shake the feeling of injustice that always followed. He stared down at the muddy slush underfoot, waiting for the official greetings to end. Once the king and his retinue moved inside, the courtyard erupted again with stable hands, guards and grooms rushing forward to tend the horses. Jon pitched in where he could, mind racing. Robert Baratheon was here, mere steps away from the crypts where Lyanna's memory lived on. How could he not sense her presence, or at least sense the weight of the past? That evening, a great feast took place. The hall was filled with the smell of roasted meats, fresh bread, and the lively tune of minstrels. Jon took a seat with the rest of the household, but far down the table, away from the main dais. He ate little, too preoccupied with watching the king and Ned at the high table. Robert's booming laughter echoed. Servants poured wine in a steady flow. Sansa wore a formal gown and tried to appear regal, while Arya fidgeted in her seat, clearly bored by the pomp. Jon picked at his trencher of stew, ignoring the occasional stares. He felt restless. Perhaps it was the swirl in his chest, the hush that felt stifled in the noise. He longed to slip away to the crypts, but that would invite questions with so many eyes about. So he remained, quietly enduring the feast until at last, hours later, the crowd thinned, and people began to disperse, either to their chambers or to smaller gatherings around the castle. Jon seized his chance to escape. He slipped from the hall, weaving through corridors until he reached the familiar stairwell. The torches along the walls were half burnt, the flaring tips spitting and popping in the still air. He descended with cautious steps, every sense alert. Down in the crypts, he was met by darkness. Most of the torches had guttered out, leaving only the murk he knew so well. He brought his own candle, lit from one of the sconces above, and its glow barely reached the shadows. The hush enveloped him as soon as he entered. Tonight, it felt thicker, more charged. He realized that Robert's presence in the castle might have stirred old wounds. His heart pounded. He felt that intangible swirl around him, not exactly welcoming but urgent, as if Lyanna herself trembled with unresolved feelings. He made his way down the corridor until he faced her statue. The direwolf at her feet seemed to glare, teeth bared in a silent snarl. The candlelight flickered across Lyanna's carved features, revealing a stern cast. Jon wondered if she resented Robert's arrival, or if she wept in unseen corners of the crypt for the love that had once been. He set the candle down on the dais and sank to his knees. The hush pressed closer, a breeze without wind, carrying a swirl of emotions he struggled to interpret. Danger, sorrow, longing. He spoke softly, uncertain if his words would soothe or inflame the spirit he sensed. "He's here," Jon murmured. "Robert Baratheon. He seems... I don't know him, but he seems loud, boisterous. I can't tell if he's changed much from the man you once knew. Maybe he has." The hush pulsed in response, pressing heavily on his chest, making it difficult to breathe for a moment. He could almost imagine Lyanna's heartbreak wrapped in that swirl of air. "I'm sorry," he whispered. I wish there was something I could do." For a moment, he thought he heard the faintest sigh behind him. He turned, candle flame fluttering. The corridor was empty, though the shadows danced. He bowed his head again, and the hush pressed forward, gentler now, as if letting him share the burden. In that poignant silence he felt the weight of an old tragedy. Perhaps these crypts held more sorrow than any mortal could ease. Still, he stayed, offering what little comfort he could, even if only a listening ear. He did not know how long he remained there. The candle burned low, dripping hot wax onto the dais. Eventually the hush began to recede, leaving him with a tired sense of acceptance. He rose, stiff from kneeling on the cold stone. A heaviness lingered in the air, but it felt less tumultuous. He retrieved the candle and made his way back, footsteps echoing softly in the gloom. At the top of the stairs he paused, startled by a figure standing in the corridor, half in shadow. His heart leaped, worried it might be one of the king's men. But the shape belonged to Ned Stark. The torch on the wall illuminated the lines of his face. He seemed worn, as if the revelry had tired him, or deeper worries plagued him. Jon felt a stab of panic, and had clearly seen him emerge from the crypts. There was no easy lie for this. For a moment, neither spoke. Ned's gaze flicked to the candle in Jon's hand, the wax nearly spent, then back to the dark stairwell. He didn't scold. Instead, he let out a low sigh. "A strange place to be at this hour," he said quietly. Jon swallowed, feeling the hush still echo in his mind. "Sometimes it's quiet there," he managed, failing to meet Ned's eyes. Ned regarded him with a sadness that made Jon's throat ache. Then slowly, Ned put a hand on Jon's shoulder. "He said at last. "It is." Jon didn't know if Ned understood. Perhaps Ned assumed it was normal curiosity, or a longing for a mother Jon never had. Ned squeezed Jon's shoulder gently, then withdrew his hand. "Get some rest," he said, his tone holding a fatherly note was rare but genuine. "Tomorrow will be busy." Jon nodded, relief mingling with a pang of guilt. He hurried down the corridor, hearing Ned's footsteps follow at a distance. He wondered if Ned ever ventured to Lyanna's tomb alone. Did he sense her spirit too? Or was Ned haunted by memories of flesh and blood, not ghostly presences? Jon mulled over it as he found his room, flopped onto his bed, and fell into a restless sleep. The next day brought more ceremonies, more formalities. Robert dragged Ned around the castle, discussing old times, lamenting the changes in the Seven Kingdoms. The king insisted on a tour of the crypts himself. Jon heard about it from the servants. That prickle returned to his spine. He wanted to be there if Robert ventured to Lyanna's tomb, but he doubted that would be allowed. Sure enough, the king descended with Ned guards and a few courtiers in tow, while the rest were asked to remain in the courtyard or great hall. Jon paced, anxious, imagining Robert standing before Lyanna's statue, remembering whatever love he once professed. Would Lyanna's spirit stir? Would Robert sense something? Jon tried to keep busy with the horses, the only chore that let him burn off his nervous energy. When Robert emerged later, the king's mood appeared subdued. He brushed off attempts at conversation, calling for more wine. Ned's expression was grave. Wordlessly, they left the courtyard for Ned's solar, where they closed the door to speak in private. Jon watched them go, heart racing. He longed to know what had passed between them in those crypts. Had Robert mourned openly, or merely fumed at lost chances? Did Ned place fresh flowers, as he sometimes did? Jon's mind buzzed with questions he could never ask. That evening, however, Jon slipped down again. He expected the hush to be turbulent, given the king's visit earlier. Instead, it felt calmer than he'd anticipated, though sadness coiled in the air like a lingering fog. He noticed new flowers, white winter roses, freshly placed on the dais before Lyanna's statue. Their fragrance hung in the cold air, delicate and poignant. Jon knelt by them, blinking back sudden tears. He thought of Robert, of Ned, of the intangible sorrow that wove them all together. "I hope he was gentle," Jon said softly, uncertain if he spoke to Ned, to Robert, or to Lyanna herself. "He must have loved you in his own way. I wish I knew more." The hush swelled in an almost tangible wave, brushing his skin like a faint breeze. He sensed no anger, only that profound grief. He touched one of the rose petals, feeling its cool softness. Then he withdrew, letting the hush swirl around him. It cradled him in silence. The dream returned to his mind, Water rushing through these corridors, destroying everything. He shuddered at the thought. Might it be symbolic of the wave of trouble that came with the king's arrival? Or was there some deeper threat yet to be revealed? Days passed in a flurry of feasts, hunts, and gatherings. Jon glimpsed Robert frequently, laughing, shouting, or at times lost in old memories. The hush in Jon's heart ebbed and flowed with each day, yet he continued visiting the crypts whenever he could. Meanwhile, rumors gained more traction. The king wished Ned to be his hand, to leave Winterfell and go south to King's Landing. Jon caught bits of hushed talk between maids or stable hands who overheard discussions. The possibility filled Jon with dread and confusion. Would Ned truly go? And if he did, what would become of the rest of the family? What would happen to Jon? He found no relief from those questions until, at last, the rumors became certain. Ned was to depart for King's Landing, taking Sansa and Arya with him. Robb would remain in Winterfell, training to rule in Ned's absence. Lady Catelyn, uncertain of her own plans, was rumored to stay behind for a while, but might follow later. Bran was excited to see the king's party continue south, but then seemed crestfallen when told he would not join. Everything felt unsettled, as if Winterfell itself braced for a shift in the winds. Jon's own fate was unclear. As a bastard, he had few rights. Would he remain at Winterfell, overshadowed by Robb, or would Ned ask him to join the Night's Watch at some future date? Jon knew the Watch was an honorable calling, but the thought of leaving behind the hush in the crypts, leaving Lyanna's spirit, cut him deeply. He tried not to think about it. Instead, he focused on the present, knowing soon the king and half the household would ride away. On the day before Ned's departure, Jon made a final, urgent visit below. The hush greeted him, strong and tender. He approached Lyanna's tomb more reverently than ever. A new bouquet of winter roses lay on the dais, perhaps from Ned's visit. Jon felt an almost frantic need to speak. He bowed his head, voice trembling. "They're leaving, or we're leaving, I'm not even sure. If I go away from Winterfell, does that mean I leave you behind?" The hush tightened around his chest. He could hardly draw breath for a moment. His eyes burned. "I don't want to abandon you. You've given me more comfort than..." He stopped, forcing back the tears that threatened. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for all you lost, for all the secrets that hold you here. I don't know if we'll meet again if I leave, but if there's any way, I promise I won't forget you." He closed his eyes, letting those emotions surge through him. A swirl of air caressed his cheeks, as if stroking away his tears. He leaned into it, imagining a woman's gentle hand, slender fingers brushing his hair back. It broke him in a quiet, shattering way. He pressed his forehead to the dais, overcome by a wave of longing for something that never was, never could be, yet somehow existed in this tenuous space between life and death. When at last he lifted his head, the hush receded gently, leaving him with a sense of resolve. He stood, cheeks damp, and gazed up at Lyanna's statue. If he was forced to go, he would carry her memory. He would keep her spirit alive in his heart, no matter where he might be sent. It wasn't enough, but it was all he had. He left the crypts, footsteps echoing, as though some final farewell played at his heels. Above, the castle yard was abuzz with preparations. Ned met with Robert behind closed doors, finalizing details. Sansa wept to bid farewell to her friends. Arya complained about being forced to travel in a wagon or on a slow horse. Robb took command of small tasks, wearing the cloak of responsibility with an air of determined maturity. Jon stood on the periphery, uncertain of his place. He considered approaching Ned to ask directly about his future, but the man was always surrounded by lords and advisors. Time slipped past. That evening, Robert hosted one last feast in Ned's honor. It was a lively affair, but with an undercurrent of tension. Jon excused himself early, citing weariness. No one questioned him in the chaos. Outside, in the darkness, the wind carried the promise of more snow. He stood by a corner of the courtyard, exhaling plumes of frosty breath, gazing up at the moonlit battlements. He wondered how many more nights he might spend here, in the only home he'd ever known. Would the hush find him elsewhere, or was it bound to these crypts, these walls? A subtle footstep behind him made him turn. Ghost-like in the gloom, Ned stood there. Jon stiffened, then dipped his head. Ned's face was calm but grave, as though the weight of the realm pressed upon him. He studied Jon in silence for a moment, then gestured for him to follow. They walked side by side across the courtyard, boots crunching on the thin layer of snow. Lanterns cast wavering patches of light on the walls. They arrived at a quieter corner near the stables, where only a single guard dozed on duty. Ned paused, folding his arms. "You should know," he said quietly, "that the king has asked me to serve as his hand. I've accepted. We'll ride south on the morrow." Jon nodded, heart heavy. "Yes, my lord, I've heard." Ned's gaze flicked upward, taking in the moon. "It's not what I wanted," he admitted. "But duty calls. The realm is in a precarious state." He hesitated, then turned to Jon. "I've made arrangements for you." Like a fear shot through Jon's chest. "Arrangements?" Ned's mouth tightened. "Maester Luwin tells me you've grown skilled with a blade. And I've seen it myself. You're nearly a man grown. It's time you considered your path. I thought you might join the Night's Watch." He winced slightly, as if expecting protest. "You'd find purpose there. A place beyond the reach of petty judgments. We can see to it that you leave with dignity." Jon swallowed hard. The Night's Watch. A swirl of conflicting emotions knotted in his belly. Honor. ... Isolation. The far north. He thought of the Crypts. Of Lyanna's presence. How would he keep his promise if he was stationed at the wall? Ned watched him, reading his struggle. "Think on it," he said. "I won't force you, but it may be the best choice. Winter is coming, and the Watch always needs good men." Jon's throat felt tight. He forced himself to speak. Would I go?" "Not immediately," Ned replied. "But soon, likely in a few weeks or a month. There's a Black Brother passing through, headed back north. You can travel with him. That is, if it's what you decide." A long pause stretched, the silence fraught. Ned's voice softened. "I know how you feel, Jon. I wish things could be different. Then it were see." Jon let out a shuddering breath. "Yes, my lord, I understand." He bowed his head, feeling small and uncertain. He wanted to cry out that he belonged here, but he also knew that was a lie in the eyes of the world. "Thank you," he managed, though the words tasted bitter. Ned nodded gravely. "We leave tomorrow. Use the time to make your farewells. Whatever you choose, I trust you'll make me proud." He clapped Jon on the shoulder, then turned and made his way back toward the great keep. Jon stood alone under the moonlight, shivering. The hush stirred within him, echoing his turmoil. The Night's Watch would be an honorable life, but it meant leaving behind the Crypts, leaving behind Lyanna. Would her spirit remain at Winterfell, bound to stone and memory, while he ventured into a harsh new world? The ache in his chest intensified. He had promised not to forget her, but the thought of losing that quiet companionship felt like losing a part of himself. He paced there for some time, ignoring the cold, grappling with a wave of uncertainty. He recalled the swirl of water in his dreams, the swirl that threatened to break these walls. Perhaps his path lay beyond the safety of Winterfell. Perhaps the hush wanted him to go, or perhaps it begged him to stay. He couldn't tell. Only one thing felt certain. Lyanna's vow to guard him was unwavering, no matter where he went. That knowledge steadied him. He drew in a deep breath, letting the crisp night air fill his lungs. Then he turned toward his chamber to gather his thoughts. He would see her one last time before dawn. Morning came too soon, heralded by a flurry of motion as horses were saddled, wagons packed, and banners unfurled. The king's party began to form up in the courtyard, and Ned's household was in a flurry of final preparations. Jon found a moment's reprieve, slipping away while the guards loaded crates. He darted down to the crypts with a single lantern. In the gloom below, he sought Lyanna's tomb, heart pounding. The hush enveloped him once more. He set the lantern aside and knelt. The white roses from the prior evening were already wilting, their tips browning slightly. He pressed his palm to the dais. "I have to go. he whispered, voice cracking. "Ned, Father, wants me to join the watch. I'm not sure if I should, but I've no choice if I stay in the north. He paused, tears pricking his eyes. "I don't want to leave you here, but I'll carry you in my heart, if that means anything." "I'll never forget." The hush fluttered around him, a trembling pulse that washed away his tears. He felt something akin to acceptance, but also a fierce undercurrent of protectiveness. It was as though Lyanna said, "I will be with you." A swirl of air brushed across the wilted roses, and one of the petals drifted loose, falling at his knee. He caught it, pressing it gently in his palm. A sob welled in his throat. He let himself cry silently, tears dripping onto the cold stone. He had never felt so vulnerable. Yet in that raw moment, he was certain of her presence, as real as the old gods in the trees. At length, a distant trumpet sounded above, signaling the departure. Jon sniffed, wiped his cheeks, and bowed low, hands trembling. "Goodbye," he whispered. Then he rose, took up his lantern, and turned away. The hush lingered, following him down the corridor, receding only as he ascended the steps into the daylight. The courtyard bustled with activity. Ned and Robert were already on horseback, deep in conversation. Arya squirmed on a pony, Sansa sitting primly on hers. Guards formed ranks around them. Catelyn stood to one side, face drawn, giving last-minute instructions to Robb and to the stewards. Jon slipped into place behind the legitimate Stark children, receiving only a brief nod from Ned. The king bellowed an order, and the procession began to move, hooves clomping through the gate in a long, snaking line. The crowds parted to watch, some cheering softly for the king. Jon glanced back only once, glimpsing the towers and walls of Winterfell, the faint swirl of wind in the courtyard. He tried to imagine the crypts below, the hush that had shaped his nights. He had not left the castle yet, not truly. He was only seeing the king's party off for a short distance, as was customary. After that, Ned would continue south, and Jon would return to Winterfell until the Black Brother arrived to escort him to the wall. The thought set a stone in his stomach, but he kept his face impassive. The hush lived in his soul now, he told himself. If the time came to stand on the wall's ramparts, facing the frozen wilderness, perhaps he would still feel Lyanna's guardianship. He clung to that hope. They rode out beyond the gates, traveling along the King's Road for some hours in a long caravan. The king was in high spirits, telling bawdy jokes and punching Ned's shoulder with friendly force. Sansa gazed at the southern knights with wide-eyed wonder. Arya lagged behind, clearly bored, or else planning some mischief. Jon kept a low profile near the rear, scanning the bleak winter sky. The hush within him remained a quiet anchor, reminding him that he was not alone, even amidst this crowd. They paused by a crossroads where a sign pointed south toward Moat Cailin. There, Ned announced that Robb and Jon would return to Winterfell, while he and the others continued on. The king urged Ned onward, eager to make progress. Before nightfall, farewells were said in hurried formality. Ned turned to Jon, hesitating a moment. Then he clasped Jon's shoulder again. "We'll speak again before you depart for the watch," he promised. "Until then, keep well, my boy." Jon bowed his head. "I will, my lord." He wanted to say more. Wanted to thank Ned or ask for some acknowledgement of what they both knew about Lyanna, but the words would not form. Ned gave a small nod, then spurred his horse to follow the king. Sansa and Arya rode off with the royal retinue, though Arya shot Jon a final glance that seemed filled with unspoken questions. The party continued south, dust and slush kicked up by hooves. Robb led the smaller group back north to Winterfell, silent for most of the ride. Jon could feel the weight in his stepbrother's posture. Robb had never been parted from his father for so long before. They reached the castle gates by late afternoon, the air chill and raw. The watchman ushered them inside, and the courtyard seemed strangely quiet without the king's bustling presence. As soon as Jon dismounted, he felt a pull toward the crypts. But he hesitated. He had just made his farewell, uncertain if returning so soon would help. Instead, he led his horse to the stable, patting its flank, lost in thought. The hush in his heart flickered. not demanding but persistent. He realized, with a surge of relief, that it had not abandoned him. He sensed Lyanna's presence, faint but warm, a distant star in the gathering dusk. Perhaps their connection transcended the stone corridors and carved statues. That thought steadied him. He brushed down the horse methodically, letting the repetitive motion calm his swirling mind. He was still grappling with the idea of leaving for the night's watch. It might be weeks, but the knowledge pressed on him like the hush of an oncoming storm. Would he have time for a few final nights in the crypts? To strengthen that bond, he swore he would find a way. When he finally left the stable, the sky had turned a bruised purple. A new snowfall drifted across the battlements. Robb was nowhere in sight, likely conferring with Maester Luwin. Servants bustled about, lighting lanterns and preparing supper. Jon passed by them unseen, his footsteps taking him toward the library tower. A part of him considered reading more about the legends of the North, about ghosts and guardian spirits, to see if there was some mention or guidance for carrying such a bond with him. But in the end, he realized the hush was not found in old books. It lived within him now, shaped by the spirit in the crypts. He ascended a narrow staircase to a small turret, stepping out onto a walkway that overlooked Winterfell's courtyard. The wind tugged at his cloak, stinging his cheeks with snow. From here, he could see the tops of the castle's various roofs, the flicker of torches that lit the walls, and beyond that, the silhouette of dark trees in the distance. The hush thrummed gently in his core, as if reminding him that no matter the path set before him, he would carry Lyanna's love. He closed his eyes, letting the cold wash over him. For a moment, he thought he caught the faint scent of winter roses in the air. Impossible up here in the swirling snow, yet undeniable all the same. He turned his gaze northward, where the wall lay unseen beyond distant hills. A realm of ice and mystery, the far edge of civilization. If that was to be his fate, he would meet it head-on, bolstered by a silent vow that he was not alone. No wind, no cold, no threat lurking in the haunted forest beyond could fully steal that warmth from him. He stayed there a long while, until the ache in his fingers forced him to seek warmth indoors. That night, after a sparse supper, he ventured to the crypts once again. The hush flowed around him softly, as if greeting an old friend. He moved among the silent statues with careful steps, paying quiet homage to each Stark who rested there. When he reached Lyanna's tomb, he placed a single candle on the dais, a token of light in the darkness. He didn't kneel this time. Instead, he stood, letting his eyes rest on her stone face, the rose bouquet still present but more wilted. His throat grew tight. "I'll come back," he promised, voice low. "Before I leave for the watch, I'll come back. And someday I'll return to Winterfell, no matter what fate has in store. You'll find me, won't you? Even if I'm far away." Mentum Tomp. The hush answered in its own way, a subtle shift in the stillness. He felt that swirl of protectiveness he had come to associate with her spirit, and his chest tightened with gratitude. This time he did not linger until the candle died. He left it burning in the crypts, a small flame flickering in the gloom, a symbol of the bond they shared. As he ascended the steps, he sensed Lyanna's presence following him to the threshold before receding into the darkness. It felt like a gentle goodbye, but not a final one. He stepped into the corridor, filled with a calm acceptance. Outside, the hush of winter and the hush of memory merged into one. The tapestry of events, Robert's visit, Ned's departure, the swirling rumor of war, had led him here to a future he could not fully grasp. Yet he walked forward unafraid, trusting in the spirit who watched over him from the crypts below, holding fast to the promise that love transcended name and station, even life and death. And in that quiet vow, Jon Snow found the strength to face whatever tomorrow would bring.